Hello everyone and welcome, I am FLC, and we are counting down the top 4 teams in the Transatlantic Splatoon League Season 2 Playoffs. We're up to our number 1 seed from North America here, our 4th and final team that we're taking a look at, which is Starburst. Now, Starburst is a very, very interesting team. The way they play the game, I don't think is like any other team in pretty much any of the regions that we have in the game, including Japan. What they do is so... I would describe it as almost like watching a jam session, right? Instead of having 4 players sort of working for the team, you've instead got 4 individual players who are all working for themselves, and then using the things that the other team, their other teammates are giving them to kind of propel themselves forwards and sort of they'll kind of build on top of what the rest of their teammates are doing. So whereas most teams will typically try to sort of have people who sacrifice themselves for the good of the team, no such sacrifice really takes place in Starburst. Even Ant, who is typically your squeezer kind of player, will still play a very kind of selfish style with the junior, not because he's not trying to help his team, but because he's playing for himself, and by playing for himself, he supports his team better that way. We'll get into the exact mechanics of that in a little bit, but for now, let's just take a look at what actually happens in this little push here as a bit of an example of what we're sort of looking at here. So, right now, most of Starburst is actually trying to sort of take control of this part of the map, and then Ant just grabs the Rainmaker and runs it through the half pipe. Meanwhile, the rest of his team doesn't really care that much. I mean, Bran is kind of locked into an inkjet here. Jared kind of comes down to help out a little bit, but he's like, oh, okay, well, I guess he took it this way. Well, I can't really do much with that. And then, eventually, the team kind of reconvenes and makes their way into the bottom side of the map. And meanwhile, this little sort of 1-2 here from Jared and Bran, where Jared's going on the grates and Bran is on the low ground, is not something that you're going to see that's coordinated. Like, it's not as though these guys are telling each other, hey, I'm going to go on the grates, you go on the low ground. No, it's more like Jared goes on the grates, and then Bran sees that and says to himself, oh, okay, well, I could probably go on the low ground. Right? That's what I mean by playing for themselves, but at the same time using what their team is giving them in order to make their own plays better. By not sacrificing themselves for the team, that means that all of them are constantly in position to control the game, and in fact, they actually pull off one of the most difficult things that you can do in this game that's also extremely effective, which is kind of, in a certain sense, a quad anchor strategy, alright? So we were talking in the FT win analysis about the idea of an anchorless team composition, where pretty much you get 4 sort of short to mid-range players, let's just pretend this is a Nautilus, and you kind of group up and you fight the enemy team in sort of a 4v4. Starburst kind of does the opposite of that. It's not that they don't get into 4v4 situations, it's just that if they do, they're kind of coincidental. Instead, what we end up seeing is situations like what I was about to develop here, where most of the team is just going to sort of take control of their own part of the map, but then they're also going to play for themselves and not sacrifice themselves, which means that they end up actually controlling large parts of the map with individual players. So we're going to see that develop right here. Right, so watch Bran and Jared, and then also note how Ice and Ant are moving. So typically when we watch most teams, what we'll see is, for example, they're going to say to themselves, alright, we want to try and make a push through the right-hand side. Which means that now everyone has this kind of same unified goal in mind, which is, okay, Jared's going to push the front door, Bran's going to try and secure the block or maybe take the flank, Ant's going to be waiting to run the Rainmaker in, Ice is going to cover with a Stingray, like that kind of thing. We don't really see that with Starburst. Instead, Starburst will do things like they'll have Jared just take control of this area just because he can. And he's just going to sit here by himself. He doesn't really care what his team is doing. He's just going to sit here, and he's just going to take control of it. Meanwhile, Bran is going to do the same thing here. Meanwhile, Ant is kind of doing the same thing in the middle of the map, trying to build up armor. And Ice is going to do the same thing here. What's effectively happening here is that all 4 of these players are working together by each doing their own thing, and then saying, like, Ant will say at some point, or maybe he won't, he doesn't really tend to VC all that much, like, okay, I've got armor, here's your armor. And he's just sort of handing that off for his team to work with, as opposed to saying, okay, I'm armoring, you go now, right? And what I mean by 4 anchors is basically this kind of setup. None of these players are really in positions to assist each other directly. But and what that means is that in the system that I usually use to describe how teams sort of operate as a group, there's sort of 4 positions, anchor being the first of those. Anchor being like your sort of first position, the core of your team kind of thing. But at the same time, if you have all 4 players in completely different parts of the map, then all 4 of them kind of effectively operate as anchors. This is kind of a little bit high level, but at the same time, it's the best way that I can use to describe how Starburst plays, which is that all 4 of them will play as though they are the only player left on their team, and they will basically put themselves constantly in situations where they can 1v4. This is different from Freeze in the sense that when Freeze, so let's say that these were Freeze players, what would end up happening is Jared would go in, see that there's a custom Jet Scorcher here, take aggro from the custom Jet Scorcher, he would start shooting at Jared, and then Jared would run away to try and get into cover. Instead, what we see is more like Jared is going to see the custom Jet Scorcher, and he's going to keep himself at a nice safe distance and just kind of keep control of this area as best he can, while sort of remaining active in that fight. The same thing will happen with Bran over here. Now, this is partly because they have mid-range weapons as opposed to short-range weapons like we saw in the Freeze games. But at the same time, that's also something that that Starburst specifically does to make sure that they have these options available to them. The other thing, of course, is that as you see these 4 players in these areas, what also happens is that, let's say Kyo and Biscuit over here move away from Jared into a different part of the map to try and surround Jared and sort of get him out of this area. What they're going to do is they're going to find themselves in the part of the map that Bran controls. So in a sense, even though Bran isn't directly assisting Jared in like he's not going to be fighting the same players as Jared, because Bran has taken control of this part of the map here, that means that Jared is actually safe on one of his flanks. One of his flanks is actually locked down. So the only way that FT Win has to fight Jared right now is to come straight in the front door, right into where he's waiting for them. Likewise, Jared does the same thing for Bran. It's not possible for anyone on FT Win to duck down sort of through this area to cut Bran off. It's not possible for anyone to come out through here and get behind him. So that means that, again, even though Jared isn't directly assisting Bran, the control that they've taken here is directly affecting how safe the other player on their team is. And not only that, but I mentioned before that this is kind of like a jam session. This comes about not because Jared's saying, I'm going to take this part, you take this part, Bran. It's more like Jared takes this part of the map, and then Bran, realizing that this part of the map is being taken by his teammate, says, alright, I'm just going to focus on this part of the map now. And then Ant, realizing that the front part is ready, is sitting here saying, alright, so the Rainmaker's probably going to move soon, so that means all I got to do here is just paint up a little bit, get my armor ready to go, and then I'll grab the Rainmaker when it's free. And meanwhile, Ice is sitting back here saying, alright, cool, looks like everything's good to go. I'm just going to get my Stingray ready to use as soon as I feel like it, right? It's not like they're telling each other to do these things. I suspect it may still happen from time to time, but what I'm seeing here is there is no unified purpose in the team, but that's also to their benefit. That's how they play, and that's how their individual players are able to piece together these kinds of really interesting pushes, because they are specifically playing to their own advantage, which means they're never really like giving themselves up and then discovering after the fact that, oh well, actually the team wasn't able to assist them. They're not relying on their team for assistance, they're relying on themselves. They're very self-sufficient players, all 4 of them. And they're all willing to take control of the game. Even Ant and Ice, who are typically, Ice is an anchor player, Ant is playing junior even though he's a squeezer main. These guys will still make plays to win the game on these more supportive weapons when they see the opportunity to do so. Ice in particular, I think, is perhaps the most impressive anchor in this entire tournament, not because he's hitting crazy shots or anything like that, which he still does, by the way, but because he will still be assertive with his weapon. Most of these anchor players, and this is kind of why I haven't really spoken about them very much, most anchor players are kind of along for the ride. It's not as though they're bad players, they'll still hit their shots, they'll still use their stingrays at the right time, but Ice will actually take command of games, whereas most anchor players do not do this. Most anchor players play more supportively. And that's what we see throughout this game. Another effect of this this sort of jam session kind of style is that because it's very difficult to actually ascertain a sort of overall purpose for the team when no such purpose exists. It's also very easy to end up in situations like this, where Kyo actually ends up over-rotating here relative to the Rainmaker, because when if we look here, we see that Jared is actually focusing on the front door right now, right? So the aggression that is being shown from Starburst in this sense is that they're going to take this part of the map. But then at the same time, that was never going to happen because Ant had his own idea of what he was going to do, and he just did it, which was to head down this way, avoid the Stingray, and get himself over here, which means that Kyo, who was in position to protect against a push coming from from the front door, ends up over-rotating, trying to take out the the custom jet, and ends up behind the Rainmaker as a result, which means that the Rainmaker can now backdoor. This is partly, like, yes, you could argue for sure that this was Kyo over-rotating and he probably should have been able to avoid the situation, but at the same time, these kinds of things are actually really common in Starburst games, and it's because it's so difficult to actually figure out what these guys are trying to do, because all their players are playing to their own strengths. We're going to move on here to TC on Inkblot Art Academy. This was a game where FT Win actually had control of the game for a significant part, but at the same time it was very back and forth. Like, both teams were able to push quite deep into their respective opponents' bases. We'll see a little bit of this kind of jam session thing going on here, where you see Jared has sort of taken aggro from most of these players, and Bran, realizing that, has actually just booked it straight into the enemy shortcut, where I wouldn't be surprised if there is communication of some kind basically between these players, like Jared saying, hey, I see 4 people. But at the same time, because Starburst is so proficient at using their individual skill to understand what they need to be doing at different points in the game as opposed to needing to be directed, Bran is already, like, right on top of this. He knows immediately what to do. So even when they do sort of tell each other, hey, we should be doing this, they don't need to really go into detail. There's no micromanaging necessary here. And we sort of see that again, we sort of see that here, right? Where, as, like, Jared's kind of trying to do his own thing here, but at the same time, there are times where having coordinated pushes are really important, and this is one of those moments, like breaking through this checkpoint here, through this choke point here, rather. And we can kind of see that when everyone's sort of trying to do their own thing, it can get a little bit sticky. But at the same time, it's not like the sort of rift problem of, like, they're not trying to run in and overextend to conserve their resources. They're instead trying to play for themselves, but at the same time, if they can't play for themselves, then it becomes really awkward for them. So in this defense, we're going to see, this was a little bit of FT Win sort of not recognizing that most of Starburst was congregating on the lower part of the, or toward the goal, I should say. But at the same time, you can see that because everyone's kind of playing for themselves, the sort of coordination here, if we back up a little bit, everyone's kind of moving in when they see the openings, which, like, they see that pick on Kyo, for example, and then everyone moves in on that pick on Kyo. There was probably a call at some point of, like, okay, I've got a pick on Kyo, let's go in. But it was pretty much, I think, the entire team already knowing that as soon as they get the pick, everyone's going to go in anyway. Right? And this is sort of what I mean by improv. They don't need to actually tell each other what to do. They don't need to make a huge fuss over, you know, who's going in when, who's riding the tower, or any of that sort of stuff. It's actually pretty much all come up with on the fly, and that's actually a good thing. In my opinion, this is actually how teamwork should look in Splatoon, where you don't really have enough players to really afford to sacrifice people, and you don't really have enough time in your pushes to afford to mess around, like, getting people in the perfect positions to make things happen. Most of the time in Splatoon, you need to actually play with just the situation that you're given. There's nothing you can really do to, like, optimize the situation further because you simply don't have time. And I mean, we see a little situation here where, like, I think this is the point where maybe Ice or Bran is saying, come on, we gotta get rid of Kyo right here, and everyone actually turns around to deal with him. But I think these are kind of the exceptions rather than the rules, and I think when you see this kind of play from Starburst, like what we see here, for example, where, okay, after they've got the pick on Kyo, now Jared's going to go to the bottom side of the map and do his own thing, but meanwhile there's a concerted push on the top side of the map that's completely separate. And there's no intention from Jared to head towards the top side at this point. Like, if there was a communication saying that the Nautilus was at the shortcut, Jared didn't really pay any attention to it, and that benefits his team, because now he's all the way up here instead of, like, being here and then deciding, okay, I'm gonna go up here to assist with that, wait, never mind, it's already taken care of, and doing this kind of path. He just goes straight in, right? So I want to make it very, very clear that I'm saying that this kind of coordination, and by the way, look where Ice is. this is I love seeing this. I absolutely love seeing this. What I'm saying here in terms of, like, not telling each other what they're doing, I'm saying this as a good thing. This is really, really good to see. Because it allows your coordination to be so quick and so intuitive, and it also means that you're really resilient in much the same way that Freeze is, in that everyone's playing to sort of stay alive. With Freeze, it's a little bit different because everyone's, like I said, trying to bait for the rest of their team to come in. Whereas with Starburst, it's more like everyone's trying to stay alive so that they can be the one who eventually 1v4s. It's a subtle difference, but it makes a big... it has a big effect on the way these teams are able to make things happen. So as we watch FT-Win's push here, just pay attention to how each of these players will try to keep themselves, like, nobody's rushing the tower, for example, to try and get the one guy off the tower so that the team can be a little bit freer to move. Everyone's just taking the fights that are in front of them and trying to live through those fights. Because at this point, especially, the push is already to 20, so there's no point trying to gung-ho rush the tower. What makes more sense is getting control of everything else, so that then you can collapse on top of the tower when you have an opening to do so. This is the way that you're supposed to be defending in tower control, but because people get this idea in their heads that they're supposed to be sacrificing themselves for the good of the team, you end up with 4 people sacrificing themselves and nobody actually being the good of the team. Instead, and Starburst basically sidesteps this entire problem. So we're going to see this final push start to develop here. So I pointed out before that Ice found his way up to this part of the map when they got their previous push off. And I think the really cool thing about this is that Ice is actually going to ride the tower this time. It's only a small difference, but it just goes to show that the person who rides the tower in these situations is not necessarily a designated tower rider. Like, Ant is actually going to win the game here with his junior being the furthest most player in the enemy team's base. He's going to get a double splat with a splat bomb and cleaning up on the inkjet. Like, this is what juniors need to be able to do. This is what I think defines a good junior player, is knowing when you have to stop being the paint bot and going in and actually making plays happen. This is what Ant does here. This is what Ice does throughout these sets. And this 4-player jam session from Starburst, I think, is a really incredible way of playing, and I'm really looking forward to seeing how they do in tomorrow's playoffs. Anyway, that's all from me for this countdown of our top 4 teams. So I'll be seeing you guys tomorrow on the analysis desk for the TASL playoffs, and that's all from me. So see you then.